and we'll be switching it off when we move to the community discussion. So with that, I want to take a minute to welcome all of you. We're so glad that you could join us today for You Got This, Learning to Lead to Lead in Crisis. I'm Christina Rowe, and my work focuses on really building collaborative leaders and teams within organizations that are welcoming and thriving. And that's through my work at the Collaborative and in partnership with the Remote Leader Project.
And I'm Danny Ceballos with Unleashed Consulting. At Unleashed Consulting, we're building better bosses. I've been in the leadership and management development space for about 25 years. I concentrate on working with primarily nonprofit and healthcare leaders on becoming better supervisors, managers, and leaders.
And I'm Lisa Stokes-Nicholas. I come to this work actually having worked with a couple dozen organizations through organizational crisis. And I also led Planned Parenthood's efforts to provide support to people on the coast after Hurricane Katrina. In fact, we're in Biloxi, Mississippi, which I see one of our participants is from. And so part of the reason I was interested in this work is because of that sort of crisis management experience. So I'm going to take just a moment to talk a little bit about what to expect from today and the other sessions, if you're going to participate in the other sessions, because it is the first of 6 sessions. Every time, today or any other time you sign on, you can expect there'll be 30 minutes of sort of content tools, if you will, management leadership tools related to crisis specific work, leading people through crisis, calming them, keeping them focused, making sure the organization hits its stride and even potentially thrives in this environment. And that'll be the first 30 minutes. And as Christina said, it'll be taped and we'll send it out to people afterwards. Anybody who signed up for that session, we'll send it out to them afterwards. And then there'll be 30 minutes of focused problem solving. Danny will be leading those sessions and he'll ask for a volunteer or two to identify something that they're struggling with that day. And we'll all work as a community to help bring potential solutions to that issue. So that, you know, today we're focusing on sort of the first job of the leader, sort of the cornerstone of this work. Moving on through subsequent weeks, we're going to talk about sort of getting beyond those initial issues and focusing on sort of core issues. We'll talk about compassion fatigue at about the time when we're all going to be experiencing compassion fatigue. We'll talk about building resiliency for yourself and your teams. We'll talk about grieving, and we'll also talk about learning to thrive and really leverage opportunities that come to your organization through crisis.
And to give you a little bit of an expectation for the Zoom side of it, we'll be having everyone on mute for the first part of it. And that's to make sure we don't get lots of echoes or crazy background noise. We'll be recording the tools part, and then we'll be turning off the recording for later. If you have any questions throughout this, please use the chat feature to chat them to me or to everyone, depending on your question. And with that, we'll dive right in.
So before we get going, we wanted to talk a little bit about what we can expect from each other as we go through this session and succeeding sessions. So we established a few group guidelines. So the first one is confidentiality. So we ask that anytime any of us are sharing anything specific about a name, a place, a situation, that we do everything we can to not bring it outside of this room. That said, we expect that and hope that you'll share the learning, the general learning and the insights that come up during these sessions with as broad an audience as possible. Our second guideline is API. If you've ever worked with me, you know that's my favorite. It stands for Assume Positive Intent. So regardless of whether it's myself or Lisa or Christina speaking or somebody else in the room, always remembering that it's coming from a good place, assuming positive intent all the time. And that's particularly helpful during this Corona time when we're working with folks that are reacting spontaneously in a lot of ways. Our third is adapt, not adopt, meaning that we hope you'll take what you learned from this session and adapt it to your particular circumstance. This is not about being 100% right or wrong. It's about providing insights, tools, and strategies that you can work with and not necessarily have to adopt 100%. Our fourth is the wisdom is in the room, acknowledging that Christina and Lisa and I have quite a bit to offer, and so do you. So to the extent possible, we will be encouraging, especially in the chat function, discussion, insights. We would love to hear your wisdom. And then lastly, we want to acknowledge that we're learning and leaning into this together. So not only using this new technology, the Zoom technology, but everything we're going to be discussing, the three of us are just as excited to learn from you as we are to help you understand how to navigate leadership during this time.
We know that there's a lot being asked of you as leaders at the moment. And one of the things we want to really start off with is think about the biggest role that's going to make the long term easier is to think about your role as the opportunity finder. That you're going to be the one who's helping your teams and your organization, no matter what your title or level is within that organization, be the ones who thrive by doing things like deepening connections between your team members to build more sustainable trust throughout the organization with one another and with your clients and members. And that really a lot of this is about being the seeker of what are those opportunities that we can do to stay focused on the possible positive outcomes that happen throughout this crisis, because that's going to help us continue to move forward. And sometimes that feels like just looking for the smaller things from time to time or what's inspiring. And so I'd ask that if any of you have anything that comes to mind that has been inspiring you through these past few weeks, to share it in the chat. And Danny's going to tell us what's been inspiring him.
So lots, I'll tell you that right now. I'm really delighted with some of the things that I see happening in the world. And everything is local in a lot of ways when we think about this, right? So when I think locally, this image that you're looking at right now comes to mind. This is a picture I just took outside of my front door just yesterday. That's my dog in the background, in the foreground, completely needing a haircut. And you'll see what my neighbors have put in their windows. So they started off with a hi. That was last week, and then they put in "You are great." And what a wonderful way of connecting us as we're walking through the neighborhood, socially distant, and being responsible. And the other occasion that has been completely inspiring is I went on Nextdoor. I have no idea how to make a mask, a good mask. I know there's tons of good ways of doing that now, and got some folks that were willing to make some masks for me. So I actually purchased some masks and helped some folks that were out of work and really looking for additional income. So there are opportunities here, small and large, locally and more nationally and by state. So keep that in mind as we're thinking about this. There are opportunities here for connection.
Hey there. So thank you for that example, Danny. And I know in subsequent weeks, we're going to be talking about, what inspires us or what are the opportunities. And so I think I'm really looking forward to hearing more of those stories. So we're going to switch now and talk a little bit about why leadership is so important. And there's several reasons leadership, we could write books. In fact, lots of people have written books about why leadership is so important, and in particular, why leadership is so important during crisis. However, we're going to focus on one particular aspect, which is what happens to your brain during crisis. And so as you see on the diagram in front of you, we all go through stages of grief during a crisis. And in fact, when I Googled for pictures of stages of grief, there was a million different kinds. People experience all kinds of things, from shock and denial to anger to hope to affirmation. But what happens during crisis is it's not a linear process. Something may happen in our morning or at the beginning of our day, and we experience shock, and then we sort of catapult to depression, and then we catapult to hope. And what happens is our brains are constantly looking for a place to land, and it sort of feels the way the second diagram is with all the squiggly marks. And so the importance of leadership in this time in particular is it helps everybody get a point to focus on. It gives everybody a common thing to really focus on, and helps their brains calm down. And so Danny's going to talk a little bit more about that. Oops, Danny's muted too.
All right. There we go. Sorry about that. So you're looking at a quote here that's actually my favorite quote in leadership, using it all the time. And it's especially and particularly important right now. It's by Max Dupree, and he says, "The first responsibility of a leader is to define reality. The last is to say thank you, and in between the servant is a leader." So Max is actually speaking to servant leadership. Max just passed away a couple of years ago, but is very, very relevant. He's speaking to the concept of servant leadership, but I want to concentrate on that very first line, that the first responsibility of a leader is to define reality. So folks are feeling very untethered right now, right? You are, we are, your folks are. The ground keeps shifting, the news changes day to day. And so at this point, as a leader for your folks, we want to first and foremost establish something that is predictable and in control and is actually a tether to something solid. And so in that, we want to encourage you to first think about defining reality. Even if you're not comfortable doing that, now is the time to start doing that. So to be clear with folks about what you know and what you don't know. So next slide, Christina. So I wanted to talk about a few concepts that we recommend, highly recommend. In fact, they are strategic steps for defining reality for your folks. The first is first understanding that you won't ever have all the information. So that's recognizing that that's true. Christina? And the very first is to say what you do know, right? So to be clear about what you know. So citing facts, figures in your world, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be about the CDC facts or the WHO facts, but in your world, what is important for people to know? So laying out the facts is the first step in establishing something where people can hang on to something real. First job in defining reality. The second is to acknowledge that you don't have all the answers. So to show vulnerability, to show humility, to show that you don't know everything is actually a critical step in defining reality. So we want folks to hang on to the reality of the facts and the figures that you're citing, and also recognize that you are not the Wizard of Oz. You don't have all of the answers. You have as many as you can provide, and we'll always start off your meetings, your interactions with defining the facts. The third is to say, well, what is the plan for moving forward? What are the steps? It is not okay to come to your folks without some semblance of what we are going to be doing next. And so it's really important for you, depending on the industry that you're in and the folks that you're working with, the level of detail is different for all of us, but to have some notion, not more than a notion, something that you can share with folks that say, these are the steps, how we're moving forward. They may change tomorrow, but this is what we're doing today. Number four, to outline what is needed, to be clear with your folks what you need from them. Now is the time to build in accountabilities, checklists, daily check-ins, those kinds of things that I know a lot of my clients are struggling with, trying to figure out, is there too much communication that can happen during this time? And the truth is, there really isn't. So whatever you can do to communicate with your folks what is expected of them will serve you very, very well. Fifth is acknowledging that things will change. So we know that, again, as much as we want to hang on to something and say, this is how it's going to be, and this is what we're doing over the next set of time, acknowledging that day to day, week to week, things are changing during this time. And again, however, this is an opportunity, folks. This is an opportunity for you to grow with your team, with yourself as a leader. And part of this is to acknowledge that you are going to be more comfortable with ambiguity during this time than you ever have in the past. And then lastly is to establish regular check-ins and updates. So how will you connect with your folks? How will you establish a regular communication back and forth with them? Let them know how it'll work. Now is not the time to back off one-on-one meetings. It's the time to lean into them. So there's a lot more to be said about these, but these are the 6 steps. And we look at them as steps that we want to encourage you as a leader and a manager to really lean into as you're defining reality for your folks.
Great, thanks, Danny. I'm going to talk a little bit now about sort of the second job of a leader. If the first job of a leader is to define reality, whether you're in crisis or not, but it's particularly important in crisis, The second job of a leader is always to define or create safety, predictability, and control for their teams related to that reality. So whatever the reality is today or next week, then the leader has to think about how to create safety, predictability, and control for their teams. And rather than talk about these academically, I'm going to give you an example from a client of mine. Some work we were doing this week. So real time, less than optimal circumstances. And by way of background, this client has first responders who are out there every day providing services to people, essential services around the globe. And so what they're doing is really, really important. And it's important that their people are well taken care of. And they've taken that very, very seriously. So we're going to start with predictability. We were talking earlier this week, actually, just yesterday, it feels like a year ago, but talking as a team about the fact that no matter what model you look at, every single model out there seems to indicate that in the US, in certain parts of the world, we're going to see a spike in the rate of deaths. And we're talking about the fact that how people, just intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, just aren't prepared for that, don't have that kind of experience. But B, it also requires all kinds of changes in plans. And so they decided, after we talked about it for a while, they decided that in order to really establish predictability, they needed to reach out to their folks and start talking about that, talk about what the trending said, talk about what the models were saying, and talked about the organization's plan, right? So what is the organization going to do if people at their centers are sick, if people who are working at the centers, their family members die, or their children become sick, so on and so forth. And so they outlined what their plan was. And I'll tell you, it's not optimal. Nobody's crazy about their plan, but it's a plan, and it's something for people to hold on to that's predictable. They also outlined how often they would be updating that plan and changing it, and why they would be changing it. So all of that is predictability. And then they talked about safety. They started talking about some of the measures. They started by reminding people about the safety measures that have been put in place since the beginning of the corona crisis, because the nature of crisis is that people's brains cannot hold all the information that's being thrown at them. And so you often have to go back and reiterate things. And so in terms of safety, they talked about the first layer of safety precautions, and then talked about additional layers of safety precautions that they've added over time. And then what the next layer was going to be, due to the fact that we were probably going to see an increase in the number of deaths, and what that meant in terms of protecting employees who are coming and going, and teams who are taking shifts at centers in order to keep them open. And so they talked about that safety piece. And then they talked about the pieces that the employees can control. And these are minor things, but they're important to remind employees that they have the opportunity for control. So they reminded them about their bereavement leave, about how they ask for bereavement leave, about what their options are for bereavement leave. They outlined options for employees to spell each other on teams, or to volunteer to spell each other. They outlined options for people to start to take care of each other in different ways. And so they gave people some control in a really uncontrollable situation. It's not optimal, it's not great, but when people are able to do that, when lawyers are, lawyers I suppose too, but when leaders are able to do that, what happens is it helps people's brains calm down and rewire from the amygdala part of their brain, which is that fight or flight part, to the frontal lobe part, which is where we all prefer to be, and where we see our clients be taken care of the best, when our employees and our teams are really operating at the frontal lobe. And I'll give you a little bit of a spoiler alert for next week. The first job of every leader is to define reality. The second job is to create safety, predictability, and control. And just like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, after those needs are taken care of, then we start to think about empathy and making sure that employees are seen, heard, and feel valued. And so they had a whole plan around that. And we'll talk about that important part of the work next week. If you want to go ahead, Christina, and go to the next slide.
All righty. So we're going to use the rest of our time today engaging with you all in a way that we hope will be really transformational for how we're thinking about how to problem solve. It's a very specific technique that I've been using for years. That is a laser-focused group coaching and support masterminding process. And so the way it's going to work is that I'm going to first of all ask for one of you, or a couple of you, if we have enough time, and I think we will, but at least one of you to come forward with a challenge or an issue that is that you're facing right now in this new COVID time, in this new leadership time. And it shouldn't be so technical that none of us would be able to help you because we don't have the technical expertise that you have. So if it's about designing a new computer program, guilty, not going to be able to help you. But if there's something about how to lead right now and the challenges around that, we would love to hear from you. So the way it'll work is you'll spend a couple of minutes telling us all, we'll take you off mute and we'll ask you to step forward, giving us some background on what the problem is. You need to be very, very succinct because we're only going to allow that for 2 minutes or so. So to say as much as you can in those 2 minutes about what the background is, what you've done so far, and what do you need from the group, be as specific as possible. Then right after that, we'll go into the next step. And the next step is, Christina, there you go, issue clarification. So issue clarification is an opportunity for all of us to ask you a couple of questions, a few questions. So the way this will work is that we're going to ask that you do it on chat, in the chat function, and we'll see what we can do to bring a few of you online if it makes sense, if Christina sees that perhaps we need a little bit more clarification from you, but to put those into the chat function, and the person who is volunteering, who's being coached in this, will look through these and will respond as appropriate so that we're all super duper clear on what the issue is, or as clear as we can be in this limited time we have. And then the third step, this is where everything comes together, is the mastermind. And we're going to devote about 8 minutes to that. And the way the mastermind piece is working is that the person who has presented the issue will be silent. So this isn't the normal kind of conversation and back and forth that you're used to with problem solving. Instead, it's welcoming disparate views, disparate ways from all over the country, from all kinds of industries, folks, and what they might suggest, resources they may point you to, strategies that they know work for them, insights that they may have. And again, I'll ask that we do this through the chat function primarily, but we have a little bit of time, so we'll be able to call on a few of you to speak to the group and perhaps elaborate a bit on what you put in the chat function. So we'll do that for 8 minutes. And as you see in the slide, during this time, I really want you to be creative, to think outside the box. There is no wrong answer. There is no wrong response. And in fact, the beauty of this is that the diversity of this group will actually be a measure of the strength that we have in terms of the breadth of responses that the coachee is receiving. And then we'll stop. We'll stop, and the coachee will now have an opportunity just to say, thank you. This is what I plan on doing, what was useful, whatever you need to say, and we'll really just give that a minute. So the whole process is only about 12, 13 minutes. And again, I think we'll be able to do it at least twice. So with that, I'm hoping we can get a volunteer that would be willing to step in.